What's up, guys? Today I'm going to show you how to synchronize the throttle bodies on a Yamaha FJ-09, also known as MT-09 tracer. First thing I recommend you do before you start this is get yourself a copy of this guy right here. The service manual. You can find this online for about 50 bucks. It's well worth it if you're going to be doing service on your bike of any kind. Highly recommend it. Before we begin, I'm going to run over basically what the service manual says the general steps are, and then I will show you how they're performed in application. In the throttle bodies, you should check valve clearance, spark plugs, air filter element, throttle body joints, fuel hoses, exhaust system, and breather hoses first before you do this. Otherwise, you're defeating the purpose. This is a brand new bike, so we're going to assume that all of these things listed are in proper working order. We already stood the vehicle on its center stand. Next, you're going to remove the fuel tank front cover, front side panel, front side cowling, remove the passenger and rider seat, remove the fuel tank cover, the fuel tank, the air filter case. Then you're going to see there's going to be little rubber caps that cover the hookup points for our manometer to the throttle bodies, and we'll remove those. We'll install our vacuum gauge. We'll probably not bother with reinstalling the air filter case, since many people have shown that it really doesn't matter, but we'll have to reconnect the fuel tank and then start the engine and let it warm up to check the throttle body synchronization. With the engine at operating temperature, we're going to adjust the two-cylinder throttle bodies, which are not standard. The standard one will be marked with a white paint mark, and we're going to adjust it until the manometer shows that they all pull the same vacuum. Should not have more than 10 millimeters or 1 centimeter of mercury difference. Okay, here we go. I covered my fuel tank with an old towel to prevent scratches. I've also laid out another dirtier old towel which I'm going to set parts on to prevent scratches. The first thing we're going to do is remove what is referred to in the manual as the fuel tank front cover, which is this black plastic piece right here. To do that, these two screws, which are 4mm hex key Allen bolts, these two, and another two on the other side of the fork, so a total of 6 screws holding this plastic cover on. So I'm just going to stick my 4mm hex wrench in here and gently loosen those up, and they should come right out. Just be careful not to scratch anything. This is a weird looking screw, and this is what's in the side of that front plastic panel. It really only has to spin one turn to come loose, and then you have normal threads on the two center screws, just to clarify the difference, but they're both 4mm hex keys. Okay, now that that's out, this should just pop out of here gently. There's a clip down here, little clip. Right there, you can see where the tab goes. Make sure that pops out. Down this side. And And it's basically off. Just gotta gently remove it. Okie doke. First piece is off. Looks like it actually clips in, falls into a lot of these slots, but it just came straight up and out for me. But it does have these plastic little tabs on it. Nothing that locks in, but just something to hold it in place. So, okie doke. The next thing says are the side panels. So this panel comes off, then this panel, and then the tank. Place 1, 2, and 3. So they're also 4mm hex on each side. The panel's not going to move to start with. It's got this piece right here that goes into this rubber grommet. Okay, and that just has to pull out. It also has this clip down here at the bottom. This clip, whoops, sorry. Yeah. Those two pieces go together. That slides down. So first pull out straight out of the rubber grommet and then down off that. And this, where the screw came out, slides out of there. And this wire has a quick disconnect right here. And we do this on both sides. Off. Side note, under the right side is where your radiator cap is. It's actually, if you only wanted to get to the radiator cap, 3 little 4mm screws, pops right off. It's actually pretty simple. Next thing we're going to do is take this piece off here, and I gotta go look at the manual to see which screws come out. The front side cowling, you've got this bolt right here, also a 4mm hex key, 2 4mm hex keys right here and right here. Slide this back so we're ready to go back. A little Phillips screwdriver right here, and this one right here. This is also a 4mm hex. So 4 little 4mm hex screws plus 1 Phillips screwdriver screw, and it'll just slide right off. Take your passenger and rider seats off. The side cowling here is just the one Allen key in the rear. The rubber grommet piece up at the front goes in there, and then there's a hook right here that hooks into that. So once you have the grommet loose and the bolt loose, you kind of want to slide it down like that, and it'll come loose. In addition, they put a little bit of Velcro here to help hold that in place, but it's just Velcro. So I think the next thing to come off is the tank itself. Alright, to remove the fuel tank, 2 10mm bolts here, and the same on the other side. 2 10mm bolts here, and I believe those are all 6 bolts holding the fuel tank on. These are not incredibly tight. The torque spec for these is 5 foot-pounds. I ended up taking out this bracket from the bottom side as well with the 2 4mm Allen screws, because you want to lift the tank up from this side to disconnect the fuel lines, and in order to make that process easy, you really want to take that bracket off. So that was taken off. You've got 2 breather hoses, one's a breather and one's a drain hose. Then you got the electrical connector for the fuel pump, and this is the actual fuel line, this braided line. and those all get disconnected. Okay, so here's the deal, guys. I got the fuel tank off, and I'm going to share with you some tricks. Number one is all the connections that you need to loosen are down here near the seat, not up here. So you want to loosen all the bolts up, but you want to first be able to tilt the back end up and disconnect all the things you need to disconnect before actually removing the tank. In order to assist with that, so you don't accidentally throw your tank somewhere, leave at least one bolt up here loosely installed. That way you can pivot on those two bolts and not accidentally have your tank come crashing down. That would be bad. Didn't happen, but it occurred to me I ought to put a couple bolts back in. Secondly, now that the tank's gone, I can show you better what's under here. These two hoses are breather hoses. One is actually a fuel drain hose, and one of them is just a breather hose. This orange connector with the braided line is your fuel line. That's a little bit of fuel spilled out there, not much. And then this is your electrical connector for the fuel pump. This just has a standard, press this little tab in and pull it down to disconnect from the fuel pump. This fuel is a quick connect, so you have to, this is installed position, push this orange thing back so it's open. Well, if I can do it with one hand. Okay, so you open up this orange thing and then you press on the blue on both sides, which are buttons. Press on both sides and pull back and it'll come loose. And I have not run my bike today. And when I first disconnected the fuel line, there was maybe 1 or 2 drops of fuel spillage, if that. So my fuel line is not particularly primed with a lot of fuel pressure. It's not like I just have been running the bike. So if possible, I would recommend you do that as well. Let your bike sit for a while. That way you're not working over a hot engine and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, a rag in here to catch any fuel drops spilled. But there shouldn't be much, just, you know, a few drops. And if I wiggle this hose around, yeah, I get a few more drops out. That's what you see mostly right here, is what stuff I've gotten since wiggling it around, rather than stuff that originally came out if I had just disconnected it and left it alone. So that's the tank off. This is the air box, and I think this is your ECU, I believe. Yep, indeed it is. So down here you can see the throttle bodies going into each cylinder. So what we need to do is remove the air box so we can get to the throttle body adjustment screws. And once we're at that point, we'll be pretty much ready to do the throttle body adjustment itself. So bear with me and I'll show you how to do that. I believe to get the air box off, you've got 1, 2, 3 4mm hex key. I'm not going to be able to get my socket in there. Nuts to loosen, which are just hose clamps, basically. Loosen up the hose clamps so that those come loose. And then when you change, it's time to change Allen keys because you know you're close. You got a 5mm, 1, 2, 3 holding the air box on. And I don't know if I have to remove the ECU. I'm going to hope not. But those 3 bolts plus loosening up the hose clamps ought to be enough to get the air box off. And assuming the ECU wires have enough slack, then there will be no need to remove that. I'll just set that off to the side. So that's it. Okay guys, so here's what happens. The ECU does have to slide out of that slot on the airbox, but it's not as big of a deal as I thought it was. You don't have to disconnect the electrical connectors, which is really what I didn't want to do. I'll show you that in a moment. The airbox comes out with the 3 screws I told you about, plus loosening the hose clamps for each cylinder. You've got this breather hose. I'm going to guess this is some sort of, yeah, this is a breather hose right here. and this is a breather hose that both clamp onto their respective ports on the airbox. Once you get the 3 screws out, you have more than enough slack to just get up needle nose pliers, loosen the hose clamp, and slide them off. And then we're ready to do our throttle body sync. But over here on the airbox, these tabs right here just lift up and they hold the ECU in place. And if you just lift up on those tabs, it'll slide right out, and then just pop the wires out of this little grommet thing here, and like I said, then the airbox comes off as one big unit. You don't have to take the cover off and mess with the air filter element in there. I think there's a seal in there that you're supposed to replace every time, so unless you need to check your air filter element, I wouldn't bother touching it. So the next thing to do is to run the engine for at least 5 minutes and get it fully warm, fully up to operating temperature, and attach our manometer. I'll probably do that before I start the engine actually, but our manometer attaches under these little rubber caps. So just pull these little rubber caps off carefully with the pliers. Don't let them fall into, who knows where. Just be careful. Don't remove the metal clips, because if you do happen to drop one, there's a good chance you might be able to retrieve it with a magnet. So there's 1, 2, and 3. Now, you'll notice on this particular bike, there are these 1, 2, and 3 screws. This one, if you can't tell, it's got a white paint mark on it. It's painted white. I think the flash, or yeah. Okay, that's white. That is the cylinder the ECU is calibrated to. We don't touch that one. We adjust these two to match this one. So, sorry. Oh, come on, focus. So you adjust these 2 cylinders to match this one. Whichever cylinder has the white paint mark on your bike, it's not always this one or the center one. Look for the white paint mark. I'm not going to be touching that one because it's got the white paint mark. So we'll open the garage door, we'll run the bike for at least 5 minutes, but really however long it takes for the engine to get to fully operating temperature. We'll watch the manometer and make small adjustments to each throttle body to bring them into synchronization. Will be interesting to find out, being that this is a brand new bike with approximately 750 miles on it, how far out of sync it is. And on a triple, out of sync throttle body can make a big difference if it is significantly out of sync. May not be. It may be that it takes no adjustment, but that's what we're here to find out. What I've done is attach the Carbtune manometer to each of the throttle bodies, and then I reinstalled the gas tank using 1 bolt in the front on each side so it could pivot up. Then I've got an empty box here, old brake pad box, that's just the right size to keep the tank propped up down here. And I've reconnected the fuel pump and fuel lines. Didn't bother with the breather hoses. Throttle bodies are right there. I can get my hand in here to adjust the screws once it's running. So I'm going to start the bike, idle it for at least 5 minutes, but really until I'm comfortable that it's good and hot. And we'll take readings on the manometer and sync our throttle bodies. So you could, if you preferred, leave the tank off, and if you had a table here, I tried to do that with a little TV tray and it wasn't really big enough to keep the tank secure for my comfort level, so I just decided to do it this way. But as long as you get the tank setting next to the bike close on a some sort of card table or something. Some people have turned the tank around and set it back this way. If I had maybe some foam so I didn't scratch the underside of the tank. I would do that, but I didn't really have any of that laying around, so this is what worked for me. So anyway, let's start the bike. I've already primed the fuel pump on here, so it should start, but if yours doesn't start immediately and it takes a moment, it's probably because you induced air into the fuel system and it needs to prime it out. Having trouble achieving full throttle body synchronization without touching the white screw, so I've got to read up on what to do. Here's the deal. I was at first concerned I was going to have to adjust the reference screw with the white paint mark in order to get my throttle bodies to sync. So I did some reading, and it looks like if you have to do that, what you should do is screw. First of all, I would recommend videotaping so you know exactly how far you turned, especially the white screw. And if you have to, you can set it back there. But turn all your throttle body screws all the way tight or in and see which throttle body is pulling the lowest vacuum, and that is supposed to be your reference. It should be the one with the white paint mark, but maybe depending on how the engine wore in, it maybe could have changed. What I discovered when I tried to adjust my white reference screw is that it already was all the way in, fully seated. So then what I did is I just took the other two, which were pretty much originally wide open, and fully seated them, and it ended up being that I was able to adjust it out. I don't know why I was having trouble originally. Maybe I was turning the screw the wrong way. I'm not sure. Anyway, I got it adjusted without having to adjust my white reference screw, so that's a win. But if you do, for whatever reason, have no choice but to adjust the right reference screw, that's what I would suggest. Videotape how far you turn that white screw, so worst case scenario, you can turn it back there. That's what I would suggest. So now the next step is remove the fuel tank. At this point, depending on how big of a hurry you are to get your bike back together, you could let your engine cool down so you're not working over hot engine. We got plans to ride later today, so I need to get this back together. So remove the manometer, basically button everything back up in the same order that it came apart, just reverse order I guess, and that should take care of it. None of the bolts we took off are of very high torque, especially any of those like weird twisty like bolts. They don't have a torque spec, it's tight, hand tight, and most of the bolts with threads are listed at 5 foot-pounds of torque, which is basically just good and snug, hand tight. You know, so I'm not going to be breaking out the torque wrench because I have torqued enough bolts to know what 5 foot-pounds feels like. That's that. So, best of luck when you do this yourself. It's full tight.